and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the webinar on US-China relations in the context of COVID 2019. NICE has been hosting a series of seminars and to discuss what will be the impact of COVID-19 around the world. Let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on this important issue, we have senior expert, Dr. Namrata Goswami. I met her in IDSC at New Delhi when I was working there. Dr. Namrata Goswami is an independent analyst and author on space policy, great power politics, and ethnic conflicts. She is a subject matter expert in international affairs with the Future Laboratory, Alabama, US, and guest lecturer at India Today class, Emory University. After earning her PhD in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, she served for nearly a decade as a research fellow at Institute of Defense Study Analysis, New Delhi, working on ethnic conflict in India's northeast and China-India border conflict. Her research and expertise generate opportunities for collaboration abroad, and she accepted visiting fellowship at Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway, La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia, and the University of Heidelberg, Germany. In 2012, she was selected as a Janine Redolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace, Washington, D.C., and was awarded as Fulbright Nehru Senior Fellowship the same year. Shortly after relocating at the US, she established her own strategy and policy consultancy in 2016. In 2016-17, she won the prestigious Minarev grant awarded by the Office of the US State of Defense and a study grant competition in the gray zone of outer space. In 2017, she was awarded a contract with Joint Special Force University to write a monograph on ISIS in Asia. In April 2019, Dr. Goswami testified before the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission on China's space program. Dr. Goswami is the first representative from South Asia chosen to participate in the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium, Emerging Security Challenges Working Group. She received the Executive Leadership Certificate sponsored by the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, National Defense University, and the Asia Pacific Center of Security Studies. Her latest book on the Naga ethnic movement of a separate homeland, stories from the field, has been published by Oxford University Press in March 2020. Her forthcoming book is on Great Power Competition in Outer Space, to be published by Lexion Press, an imprint of Roman and Littlefield. I would like to request our participants to drop questions in the chat box or in the comment box below the Facebook Live. Dr. Goswami, the floor is yours. You can take roughly 20 to 30 minutes and we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal. I am very, very honored and delighted to be invited to participate in this webinar. The Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is a great initiative, and congratulations for getting it going and including so many international events. I think that's a great start. So today, as Dr. Jaiswal has mentioned, what I'm going to talk about is US-China relationship, especially in the context of COVID-19, because it's important to understand that, because the structural nature of that has had an impact on how US and China are starting to view themselves. And I'll also speak a bit about the post-COVID diagnosis as to what can happen. So let me share I have a PowerPoint, so I would like to share that. So it says host disable participant screen sharing. Promote.
Sorry, ma'am. I think it is allowed. Try once again.
Yeah, now it's allowed. Thank you. Sorry, let me. Are you able to see it?
Not yet, not yet.
I'm sorry, my computer is creating some issue here. I don't know what is happening here. It says iPhone installation. Let me try again.
It does show that your screen is being shown,
Oh,
but
can you see
we can't really see what's on your screen.
That's very, yeah, let me stop share and try again. Okay, let me try again. Here we go. Can you see it now?
Yes, ma'am, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, so sorry about that. I had, always happens with technology. But anyway, so let's go to the, so let's look at the context of the topic today. So before we go to a bit of diagnosis about US-China relationship in the context of COVID, I think it's important to realize that we are now living in a world where the Chinese economy surpassed the US in per capita income, GDP, in 2018. It's also important to realize that China has become one of the second most important power in terms of military spending and capacity. So if you look at the budget for the US military this year, it's about $712.6 billion, whereas China is about 178.6. But then there is a bit of questioning on that particular military spending, because the International Institute of Strategic Studies argues that it could be more, because we do not have an official document stating how much is being spent. But the other important point to realize is that the return on the US dollar, for instance, in China is higher than the return of the US dollar in the US, given the difference in exchange rate. Now, the area that I study for the last 5 years is space. And you can see that China's spending in space is about $8 billion. About 2 billion of that is in the private sector, whereas the US spending overall, including NASA, the US military, and the private sector is about $41 billion. And so 19 billion is for NASA. But again, I'll make that comment that, again, this depends on the exchange rate and the return of money on the dollar. Now, what is interesting from a military strategic perspective is that there is this argument that given the fact that there is conventional asymmetry between the US and China, with the US far ahead, so the area where China is looking for maneuverability and ability to sustain its capability for independent action is space. The other interesting argument coming out from this particular perspective is that there is also other means of influence in international relations, especially between countries like the US and China, and that is to have alternative institutions where each has influencing power in the long term. Now, the most important crux to understand the US-China perspective and relationship is to understand the fact that there are two very different political systems we are dealing with. The US is a democratic system. It has presidential elections every 4 years. You have your representative in the US Congress who are elected by the people. Whereas the Chinese system is more a one-party system, so you do not have the kind of changeover of regime as you have in the US. So what that means is that you are able to have much more long-term strategy and policy in China vis-a-vis the US. I could give you an example. For instance, the US mission for space keeps changing given which administration is in power and its own values and ideologies it wants to forward. Whereas in China, whereas I'm studying that once they focus, say, on the moon in 2006, that focus has continued for the last 15 years. So it's a much more, it's a system that supports a much more longer strategy and capability building. Now, let's get to the context of COVID. That is the topic of today. So China-US relations has had interesting diversions and perspectives. So if you look at the pre-COVID context of US-China relation, you had Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, who was actually the US ambassador to China. And he actually saw China as an important player in the world and worked very hard to develop a dialogue mechanism. He was actually, he actually dealt with several disputes or tensions that happened between US and China. One was, of course, the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1982, and then the Tiananmen Square, 1986, sorry, and the Tiananmen Square crisis, which happened in 1989. But he, I think when he first, and he also visited China when he was president. But what is interesting is that he actually, in the beginning of his presidential term, wanted to build a cooperative relationship with China. But after Tiananmen, I think he was much more skeptical whether you could have a transparent relationship with one-party system country. Bill Clinton, actually, who followed him, supported comprehensive cooperative engagement with the US. So it's interesting. Now, this is where I think we have to, I would do a disservice if I do not explain to you that this also is the impact of the larger theoretical perspectives that influence US policy vis-a-vis China. So we cannot forget that when Bush was president, you had the end of the Cold War in 1991. Then you had the first Gulf War, where China was astounded by the US capability in the Gulf War based on its space assets. So there was an awakening within China for the importance of space technology. But the other important overarching influence besides just realism or national security was that there was this liberal institutionalist hope that if you include China in the international system, that could lead to a democratic change within China. And this, despite the Tiananmen Square crisis, was an influencing factor with, for instance, President Bill Clinton focusing on a comprehensive relationship with China. Now, when George W. Bush became president, he also supported a comprehensive engagement with China. He actually was the president when China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. And he also hoped that with China's inclusion into the world body, you would be better able to manage China's economic policies and also its currency strategy or currency policy. It'll be important to realize that George Bush's focus, which remained great power till September 11, 2001, changed after that and was more focused on fighting terrorism and the war in Iraq, and which kind of diverted his attention from great power politics. When Barack Obama followed him, his first 4 years, he actually was more open to having a good relationship with China. He even toyed with the idea of a G2 with China, which was forwarded by Brzezinski. And Obama truly believed that if you include China or have an equal relationship, you will have a much more better transparent China, given the certain issues that the US was worried about at that time. More importantly, trade policies, trade deficit, and intellectual property theft. In the second term, I think what changed was that in 2010, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, if you remember, gave a speech at the ASEAN Forum in June at Hanoi, Vietnam, where she forwarded for the first time the idea of the Asian pivot. And this kind of put China on alert, because it sounded like a containment of China strategy where there was a rebalancing of US focus to Asia. And so that meant that you also started looking at China's growing influence as a concern because of the fact that the more Chinese influence grew, the US policy perspective was that the lesser our influence will be. So his perspective changed in the second term. And then, of course, now we are living in the presidential administrative time of Donald Trump. So when Donald Trump came to power, his perspective was very clearly about China being a currency manipulator. The trade deficit was something he talked about. He talked about bringing back manufacturing to the US. He highlighted the issue of intellectual property theft. And also, he also had this interesting slogan which talked about America first, and which continues today too. I was just listening to his rally in Tulsa, where he again pointed it out. And he also kind of is building this narrative of China as an adversary, especially in the COVID-19 context, because he keeps referring to the COVID-19 virus as the China virus. And I'll explain to you what that does to the American population and their perception of China. Now, something that we also need to understand to have a perspective of COVID-19 in the US is that the Hong Kong protests against the extradition proposal from China galvanized American support for their peaceful protests, and at times which we saw demonstrations which tended to get violent. But what was interesting was that the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests resulted in a Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act 2019, which passed the House, but I don't think President Trump has signed it or it has passed the Senate. But what was interesting was that I was a part of the China Forum hearings at the Senate, and I presented, of course, on China in space. But we had presentations from the Hong Kong leaders talking about how their rights have been restricted and Hong Kong's status as an autonomous region is under threat. And as we speak, China has a Hong Kong national security law that could see any kind of collaboration or support from outside as treason. And that is concerning from Hong Kong's perspective. So it's important that this particular Hong Kong protest galvanized US representatives to support Hong Kong. And it is in this context that COVID-19 actually happened. So let's get to the context of COVID-19. So the first case of COVID-19 was, of course, reported by China on December 30th, 2019, when they received the first sampling. And the first case of COVID-19 in the US was January 21st in the state of Washington. The World Health Organization declared a pandemic on March 11, 2020, and Trump followed immediately after, and he declared a national emergency in March 13, 2020. Now, as of today, the data shows that 2 million Americans have been infected and we have more than 200,000 deaths. So this has actually changed the context in which US-China relations is forwarding based on those points that I gave to you before. Even before COVID-19, the relationship was tense, but this structure of COVID-19 has made it even more combative to an extent. So one of the controversy that has raged in the US is the origin controversy. So there is a point of view that and especially forwarded in the beginning, including by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who is pretty influential in the Trump administration, who argued that this is actually a lab-originated virus and could be a part of China's bioweapon warfare. We had testimony to the US-China Economic Commission that argued that the fear that this could be used as a weapon to weaken a particular population. And also there was this other perspective that it could be an accidental release, but it's still a lab originated virus. Or then there's the other concept that this could be a wet market. This controversy reached such a head that the US Director of National Intelligence released actually put forward a press release where they argued that given the scientific consensus, this argument that this is a lab-originated virus is not supported by science evidence, and they are on the side that this is a natural phenomenon. And the other question which influential Trump administration advisors like Steve Bannon argues that how can you explain the fact that you have such a high spread of the virus outside of the US, but such limited spread within China? And that kind of perspective is very much here in the conservative circles, depending on which channel you're listening to. And I think it's important to realize if we want to have a holistic picture that that there is a divergent perspective on the virus, but there is this increasing fear given China's lack of transparency, that we could have a second virus spread wave. Now, as I mentioned before, US-China COVID relation is also look within the frame of international relations theory. One is, of course, the realist frame, which advisors like Steve Bannon, Trump to a large extent, Peter Navarro, Trump's trade advisor, accepts, and that is China constitutes a national security threat. And I'll explain to you in a bit the documents that they have forward. Then you also have a liberal perspective, which argues that this is truly an accidental virus and that China has actually collaborated, and that perspective is also there, but not the stronger perspective, but it's there. And then, of course, I'm going to take you have constructivism that argues that China-US relationship, COVID, pre-COVID and post-COVID will depend and could go towards more cooperation depending on the amount of social interactions they have, dialogue they have, and an ability to change perspectives based on that. I would actually offer a different perspective, which is a more neoclassical realist perspective, which looks at the influence of both the structure, which is the structure of international relations and what's happening there. And that is the tension between US and China as to who is going to be the leader of the international system. And a domestic level analysis where I'll show you how the changes in common Americans' perspective of China has actually emboldened the Trump administration's argument that China constitutes a real threat to the American-led world order. So one is elite consensus. One of the frame that I'm taking is to argue that if you look at the COVID-19 context, you have had representatives in Congress that argue that China constitutes a concern and a strategic threat. And their argument, and this is bipartisan to an extent, that argues that the lack of transparency with regard to COVID-19 data when it first started, China's unwillingness to share data with the World Health Organization's very late declaration of the pandemic as a pandemic has to do with China's influence. You can see Nancy Pelosi in the picture meeting the Hong Kong pro-democracy protester. You have Steve Bannon arguing that China constitutes a threat in the long run, both economically and politically. I would recommend this book, Trump versus China by Newt Gingrich, who again has deep influence on Trump, who argues that China constitutes the biggest long-term systemic threat, and he lays out certain factors why. Now, the other important thing is that you have a COVID-19 Accountability Act that hasn't passed Congress, but has been proposed as a legislation that wants to sanction China for its lack of accountability vis-a-vis COVID, including the closure of student visas to Chinese students, a very stringent measure. But you can see that this conversation is happening in an elite perspective. The one document which I find a very clear articulation of the Trump administration's official policy is the United States Strategic Approach to the People's Republic of China. And in that particular document, which is available online, the argument is that China constitutes a long-term threat. China wants to undo the American-led world order by 2049, which is the 100th year celebration of the PRC. And therefore, America needs to build resiliency within its society and its international alliances to deal with this particular perspective. And what is interesting is that they recognize India's security and growth for all in the region as an important common vision for the region of Asia Pacific, or Indo-Pacific, if I may. Now, the second analytical frame is social cohesion, and this is very important to understand. So what has changed in the American perspective is not limited just to the representatives of Congress or the White House. This particular perspective has now become a part of lore, by folklore. For instance, if you look at the Pew Research Center survey that conducts survey of American opinion of China since 2005, for the first time in March 2020, they published their survey, and you could see that the negative perception of China has increased. And what is even more interesting is that this is not just limited to Republicans who tend to have a more negative perspective of China, but also to Democrats who usually seem to have a much more favorable perspective of China vis-a-vis their liberal institutionalist perspective. But COVID has actually impacted Americans on a very personal level across bipartisan lines. And so today, when I go out of my house and go for a grocery shopping, there are conversations which I overhear where they feel impacted by loss of business, impacted by loss of family members from the COVID-19 virus, huge societal, loss, and unemployment in the millions. And they see this as impact of the COVID-19 virus that originated in China. And this perspective has also, if you look at US mainstream articles, there are several articles that talk about holding China responsible. And you can see that the Democratic Party is also slowly talking about this, because the population is talking about it in a much more personal level. And that change, I suspect, will impact American policy towards China. Now, the third analytical frame, which is very important, of course, is to understand the structural impact of all this. And so the biggest concern coming out of the US is the dependence on China for critical infrastructure, to include the dependence for medical supplies, ventilators. If you listen to Andrew Cuomo's daily briefings, the New York governor, he very clearly identified the lack of ventilators as the biggest problem, and New York was the most affected by COVID-19, and the American states' dependence on supply from China. And so there is this fear that if you depend on critical infrastructure from China, that limits America's ability to maneuver in foreign policy. There is conversations about the trade deficit. If you see this graph, can you see that it's very clear that the US has a huge trade deficit with China, and then there is conversation of bringing that down. We already have sanctions on US Chinese goods. About 25% was first started in June 2018. And then today we also have China, of course, imposing sanctions. And then the final structural impact that is starting to happen is that US is talking about diversifying its manufacturing base, which had remained China, but today they're talking of diversifying it to other areas. Now, important to understand is how is China reacting to all this, US, because after all, we're talking about US-China relation. So China's response to US, those analytical frames that I talked about in terms of elite negative perception of China, backed by American populations, negative perception, and the structural frame, is that they have started a huge counteroffensive. One, if you listen to their conversations, they argue that the US has deliberately started the idea of lab origin of the COVID-19 because they want to discredit the Chinese government's response to the virus. The Global Times recently ran an article that argued that Mike Pompeo's assertion that the virus was released by a Wuhan lab is not backed by any scientific evidence. And so you can see this, and also Chinese diplomats are using social media much more in countering the narrative. In fact, Politico ran a survey or did a sampling of how many times Chinese diplomats use social media in March to now, and according to their analysis, it has increased about 90%. So it's interesting. Now, the important point is that within China, there has been a counter argument that the Wuhan virus actually did not originate in China, but was actually exported by US military during the military games in October 2019. And this perspective was not just limited to Weibo, it was even forwarded by a Chinese foreign ministry official as a counter narrative, or he tweeted a website that argued this. So you can see the tension at even the frame level, not just in terms of hardware level, but in the software of narrative of how is China countering. Now, if you are interested, China has published a COVID-19 white paper in June, first week of June. And in that particular white paper, if you read it, you realize that that response is basically to the criticism that Americans are holding China responsible in terms of lack of transparency. So, and also the lack of leadership by Xi Jinping. So in the COVID-19 white paper, it argues that President Xi had great overarching leadership, was very responsible. China was very transparent. And what is interesting is that China is actually responding to the critique thrown by some part of American media on the Trump administration that Trump lacks a scientific perspective by very strongly offering a perspective that China's response to the COVID-19 virus is extremely scientific. And then they argue that if you hold China accountable, what you're doing is you are actually, it's a slur on 1 billion Chinese and the medical workers that are putting their lives on the line. Now, in terms of diplomatic efforts from China to counter the US perspective on China, overarching perspective, is that they have actually started an alternative mechanism of offering medical help to countries that suffer from COVID-19. Of course, one is Italy. When Italy was ravaged by the virus, it was China that sent doctors and medical supplies to Italy. A similar story repeats in Spain, the UK, and Greece. President Xi inaugurated the Health Silk Road under the Belt and Road membership, where he argues that China is going to offer medical supply and create this very resilient system under the Belt and Road initiative. So you can see that China is actually not keeping quiet vis-a-vis US criticism of China's handling, but actually starting a completely alternative narrative of legitimacy and influence. And then just recently, I think last week, China constituted the China-Africa Summit on solidarity against COVID-19. And if you see this picture, this is a moment of silence that calls for such resilience between China and Africa. And then the other thing which will have a deep impact on which country will have the larger influence is that who is going to first offer a vaccine to the world? Because ultimately the world would want to go beyond this particular tense perspective to having a vaccine that saves humanity from the virus. Now, I have my final 2 slides. I know I'm running out of time. So what would a post-COVID diagnosis look like based on what I just presented? So I think from the US perspective, the US would want to take leadership of the world, not just in terms of influence, but also in terms of having influence across domains. So it would not just have, it would just not just mean political influence, military influence, but it will also mean a restaking of leadership in space. There would be a decoupling of the China-US economy. There'll be an effort for that. We've heard Trump talk about it. We've heard his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, talked about it. And by the way, Peter Navarro has a long-term perspective of China, and his book, Death by China, is a continuation of what he is actually advising Trump today. You will have major calls for manufacturing relocation. And what is very interesting is that American public opinion on China is not going to remain just focused on cheap goods from China that you find at Walmart, but it'll start looking at China from the perspective of constituting a threat to their way of life, vis-a-vis the fact that they have had enormous suicide rates, death from the COVID-19 impact on American public opinion. What will China's post-COVID diagnosis look like? So China would basically constitute a legitimacy building effort. It would offer economic measures to salvage US-China relations. And in fact, that has already occurred in Hawaii just last week with the meeting between Mike Pompeo and the Chinese foreign minister. The Chinese foreign minister agreed to buy $200 billion worth of US agriculture goods. So you can see that China would use its economic leverage to try to bring down the tension between US-China relation. China would develop an alternative space capacity. After all, we are very much dependent on space for everything, including this meeting that we are having. Without GPS and space structure, society would completely collapse in today's time. So China would build an alternate system. And in fact, they're launching the last satellite for their Baidu navigation system, I think sometime next week. China would highlight the Belt and Road Initiative and the impact that it has on countries that are members, about 89 countries. It would try to create alternate resilient mechanisms. And the final diagnosis I would have is that there will be a tug of war between Trump's America First policy and China's dream policy offered by President Xi Jinping. And so countries will start looking at both perspectives and very strategically decide which particular perspective benefits them more. So you do have an interesting framework that would be utilized to study US-China relation. I'll end there, Pramod, and look forward to questions.
Sure. We've got lots of questions, so I'll be putting them in set of 3 so that you can club them together if necessary. The first question is like, will US-China trade war affect China's BRI project and Indo-Pacific strategy? Second is, does the corona crisis has the potential for US-China military slowdown? And third is it the beginning of another Cold War, and what will be the stand of Russia? What's the impact of China-US relationship over Indian subcontinent?
Okay, so the first question is, can you repeat the first question? I didn't hear the first question.
Like, what will be the impact on BRI and Indo-Pacific strategy because of US-China trade war?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the trade war, already you can see that there are alignments that have happened vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific. First of all, the most important alignment that has happened is US-China, US-Japan, Australia, India, right? In terms of the strengthening of that particular partnership. You also have the renaming of the Indo-Pacific as Indo-Pacific from Asia-Pacific. Now, in terms of trade war, the concern that would happen is that what would happen to the supply chains? Because ultimately what matters in the trade war is that we have a long supply chain. So it's not just about decoupling based on a finished product. You have supply chains that the world is dependent on China. So what happens if you suddenly have sanctions from the US on a particular supply, and that supply is critical for continuing the critical infrastructure, say in a country, allied country like Japan, right? And so that would have an impact, long-term impact in terms of the decoupling. The decoupling is not as easy as we think it is, because ultimately Chinese manufacturing and supply of critical assets like ground solar or even in terms of high-end technology like AI and robotics is very deep. And so it will have an impact of creating tensions on the supply chain vis-a-vis the trade war. Now, the second question I think is really interesting. So will the coronavirus lead to some kind of a military showdown? I do not think that's likely, because first of all, you can see that China has offered a narrative which is very much about how responsible they are. And the second important thing is, if I listen to the conversations in the US Congress, which actually can sanction a war, you can see that their perspective is to somehow have better data on how the coronavirus spread, hold China accountable in terms of their offering a much more open, transparent system of how the virus was detected, how did it spread, how was China able to limit its spread, and first, more importantly, why was it that it spread to countries like Italy and Spain so fast, and also to the US? What was it that China didn't do? And so that, I think, could be the conversation. Whether it will lead to a hot war, I don't think it's likely. I might be wrong, but at least from what I see in terms of the diagnosis, I haven't heard that kind of conversation coming out. And also there will be military opposition to that kind of escalation of conflict. After all, both countries are nuclear weapon states. Both countries have a lot to lose if you have a hot war. China has the capability to target US bases in Asia through its missile system, US space assets, which are vulnerable. And as we know, the US military is very much dependent on space for command and control. And so I think there is going to be a much more restricted perspective on this. In terms of the Cold War, is it going to lead to some kind of a Cold War between China and India, China and the US? I think that is possible, and I think it's already happening. So in terms of, if you look at the strategy documents coming out of the Trump administration, including their space strategy, their strategy on China, which is the most articulate expression of how the US views China, President Trump has signed several White House executive orders that calls out China for intellectual property theft, for lack of transparency with regard to its currency manipulation. You know that the US Treasury declared China a currency manipulator in November 2019, and then of course changed that, that evaluation 2020, but that's a way of building pressure. And so I think, and you can also see that kind of rivalry now happening in space. And I think it will be a Cold War, but not the kind of Cold War that we saw between the US and the USSR. The characteristics will be very different, because we cannot simply forget that the China is not the USSR. The USSR was not integrated to the world economy China is. China is deeply integrated to the world economy. And think of a situation where today US completely cuts off China. Where do you think they'll get their medical supplies from? The US is still dependent on almost every critical drug on China. And that's why there are also arguments coming out of the US that we need to go slow on this, because what happens if China strategically uses that medical supply chain to counter the US? So that could be a problem. But I think one book that identifies this long marathon is Michael Pillsbury's The 100-Year Marathon. So it's a fascinating book that offers you a perspective of how it's going to be a long, drawn, tense situation with China. Given the fact that I have said that both countries are not just fighting over COVID, but they also have tensions at the structural level of international relations. What is Russia's role? Russia, at this point of time, is of course has better relationship with China than with the US. And so if in this particular in this particular situation, it will tend to support a Chinese perspective on the Cold War. But we also know that Russia can change its stance depending on its own national interest. And we also know that despite terrible tensions between Russia and the US, they still collaborated on space. US was dependent on Russian rockets to fly to the International Space Station. So,
let me come with the next set of questions. How do Beijing's disinformation campaign and China's increased military belligerence alter the trajectory of the post-COVID US-China relationship? Second is, if China or US is able to create COVID-19 vaccine, do you think they will distribute those vaccines for free to other countries? And third is, what is US view on humanitarian issues of Uyghur Muslims?
okay. So as I mentioned in the diagnosis in terms of Beijing's disinformation campaign vis-a-vis US-China relation, I think the impact is going to be very deep, because ultimately what the US, I'm talking about the US elite perspective. And by elite, I mean intellectuals, elected representatives, right down to the state and council level, not just the House of Congress. I think what will happen is that there will be even more realization that the Communist Party of China is not a transparent body, which they have been arguing for long, but there was this hope that there would be much more reform and opening up. And so given this disinformation campaign where there is no acceptance of any kind of responsibility, and if you see the white paper, it's a big defense of President Xi, I think the US will realize that this particular world order post-COVID, where this Communist Party of China is going to become even more powerful, is not to US interests. And so there will be efforts bipartisan that would want to limit that particular Chinese influence vis-a-vis what happened in terms of the disinformation campaign and in terms of how China is trying to shirk responsibility. Now, in terms of, I think the second question was on vaccine, right? If China offers a vaccine or US, would they offer it for free? Well, China has already made statements that it would want to offer the vaccine for free to countries along the Belt and Road, the 89 countries. So whoever discovers the vaccine will have huge influence on how the world views it. So if China, now let's play, I do scenario planning. So let's think strategically and long term. So if China is able to come out with a vaccine, say in the 18-month period that it takes to have a vaccine that is clinically tested and has been able to create antibodies. And if it offers it for free or for a very less price, which is capable of, given the fact that its manufacturing is much cheaper, that would actually create a legitimate narrative that shows the Communist Party of China as being humanitarian and much more legitimate. Now, if the US offers such a virus, will it be able to offer it for free? I'm not really sure, because US manufacturing and medical expenses are very high. Even if you look at the American medical system internally, they're not able to offer medical public health to their own citizens. So there will be this tug of war and US capability to offer it for free. So whoever is able to offer it for a lesser price will have long-term strategic influence in how countries start viewing it. Now, in terms of Uyghur Muslims and US perspective, there are very strong documents that exist in official circles and also in media and academia that views the treatment of Uyghurs as a humanitarian crisis. We have had hearings in the Senate where I participated in the China Forum, where we were shown documentation. These are open hearings, so they are publicly available. So, which shows the impact of China's policy of organ plants, and so it's a very, very strong narrative of how the Chinese Communist Party is limiting Uyghur humanitarian rights. And not just that, in terms of putting them in camps and using them for organ transplant. It's a very, very strong narrative in the US, especially in circles that view China as an adversary.
We have another set of three questions. How do you see China's move in Western Pacific, like sinking of Vietnamese boat, surveillance along Miyako Strait, and America's inability to restrict it? Is China planning to leverage the COVID-19 crisis to charge the status quo in the region?
Okay.
Second is, how much do China's action in India signal its intentions elsewhere, such as in Hong Kong or Taiwan? How do you see the upcoming intellectual property and knowledge sharing perspective between China and US? The case of Huawei and 5G can be relevant on this.
Okay, let me deal with the first. These are talks on themselves. So, but I'll try to do justice. So, how do we see China's activities in the South China Sea, including the sinking of that particular vessel by Vietnam? I think China, so I have followed the South China Sea, and as you know, Pramod, I have been studying the India-China border for a very long time. So including the eastern border, not just the western border. And I come from Northeast India, from the state of Assam. And I did a lot of field work in the Indo-China border area, so I can offer a perspective, but I will not try to be too elaborate because we need to take more questions. But so how do we see China's South China Sea? Will it use the COVID-19 context to build leverage and kind of take over territory by force? Well, it's interesting because I think what is very important to realize is that China's perspective on territorial disputes, especially areas that they say is theirs, have been a very consistent policy, right? So their claim on the South China Sea has been going on since the 1970s. They have had a very unilateral perspective on the South China Sea, where they argued that South China Sea is a part of their territory, and so as a part of their core value, core interest. And so the other countries that disputed, if at all they want some kind of dialogue or negotiation, it has to be either bilateral or through a forum like ASEAN. And even there, China wants to be the lead actor and also wants to insist that the South China Sea is not a part of that particular narrative. So how do I see the escalation of conflict as a continuation of President Xi Jinping's policy towards the South China Sea? So for instance, the hardening of the islands that happened when Obama was the president. So, and it is interesting because President Xi met Obama in the White House, say in, where was that, 2015 in September. And so, and in that particular, I might be wrong about the month, but I think the year was when 2015 was when he met President Obama. And in that particular meeting, when Obama asked him about the building of islands, I think he argued, or he pointed out that, or 2016 maybe, where he pointed out that, oh, we're not building any islands, you're just unnecessarily concerned, or we will not be building islands. But then, once he got back home, of course the islands were built. You have now a military installation in the disputed islands. And so what is happening now is, of course, taking advantage of the COVID-19, where the US military itself is constrained in the South China Sea, to escalate China's claim in the area. Now, what is interesting is that, so is the US hand much more tied because of COVID-19? I do not think so, because even when we did not have COVID-19, did the US respond to the building of military installations in the South China Sea? No, it didn't. Of course, it had a lot of shaming and naming China internationally. Philippines went to the International Court of Arbitration. But did the US militarily respond in support of its allies? No, it did not. So I don't think that is going to change in terms of South China Sea. And China will, of course, escalate during the COVID-19 crisis. But that has been a part of President Xi's policy. So when he became president in 2013, President Xi said that China will get very serious in terms of territorial claims and what it sees as disputed territory. And so you can see this particular status in the India-China border as well. So if you follow if you read my writings, and I've been writing on the India-China border since 2007. My first article was on strategic road building in Arunachal Pradesh, where I talked about how China would use infrastructure to establish claim in disputed territory, or it would build infrastructure around the disputed areas, say, for instance, in its side of the LAC and Tibet. And this was in 2007 when I wrote this. And so, and it's available, I think, in the IDSA website, where I argued that India needs to build strategic infrastructure on its side of the border, not just for its own strategic signaling, but to reassure its own population. For instance, the Arunachali population was very concerned when it talked about strategic road building on the Chinese side. So in terms of the current border crisis, it seems to be continuing the pattern that happened for the last 10, 20 years. In 2013, when a very similar incident happened in Ladakh, where Chinese PLA soldiers established tents on the Indian side of the LAC. India responded, but did not, of course, respond the way it happened this time. So it's a continuation of the pattern. But what has changed is, I think we have two very different regimes or administrations in both countries. In India, you have a Narendra Modi-led government, which is much more willing to engage with a country that violates its perception of the LAC. And also you have a national security advisor, Ajit Doval, who has a policy of challenging someone's illegitimate claim on a particular area in India. So that is what has changed. Has China taken advantage of COVID-19 to escalate its claims? It would appear that way because the world is, of course, caught elsewhere. And especially the United States is dealing with a crisis internally, so much so that its capability to respond externally has got limited. But that again is a pattern. So if you look at 1962, when China and India were engaged in a border war, guess what was happening in the US? The Cuban Missile Crisis. John F. Kennedy was so much caught in dealing with missiles in Cuba that his response to the India-China border conflict was very limited. So I see a very similar context here today. So yes, it could be taking advantage of how the US is diverted or the world is diverted in this particular area. But then there are other structural conditions that continue to remain the same.
Let me come with another set of three questions. Can the rise of health diplomacy help smoothen the existing constraints on Sino-American relations? How can we decide whether the China's approach to disturb the American hegemony will be destructive to the world?
Can you repeat that question? Can you repeat the second question?
How can we decide whether China's approach to disturb the American hegemony will be destructive to the world? And third is a follow-up questions. As a follow-up question to Namrata Goswami's remark on Russia, I would like to ask her thoughts on Russia's role in the latest India-China standoff in the backdrop of Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh visiting Moscow today.
So can the rise of health diplomacy lead to some kind of cooperation, and especially in the US-China context, right? So I would argue that it will not be helpful in terms of creating some kind of shift towards a bigger or stronger relationship with China vis-a-vis the US narrative that exists today. So, so it's very, very important to understand that in the US societal narrative and and the kind of constructed narrative that's happening in the policy circles, where you can get constructivism in too if you want, and strategic culture. So strategic culture is how policy and military elites perceive their, view of the world. So does the world constitute a threat or an opportunity? And this is very much influenced by past history, past experience, their own political culture and modes. So in that context, China's health diplomacy in terms of, say, the Health Silk Road, which President Xi has announced, I don't think the US is going to buy into that, given the fact that it's not just about health, right? So when we talk about health diplomacy, we also have to see the larger context of international relations. So had it been just health, and had it been just limited to that, that would probably have happened, that there would have been a leveraging of tensions. But this is not just limited to health. This is a far larger tension and strategic narrative that actually is influencing US policy. And so I would not see that having a deeper impact. Now, how do we decide whether China's approach to the US is going to be destructive to the world? I did not understand the question, approach to COVID or approach to how it's viewing the US?
It's not clear.
Yeah, it's not clear. So let's say that the person asking the question wants to know that, will a China-US, let's take a hypothetical scenario, right? So if there is a conflict, like a military confrontation, is it going to be destructive to the world? Absolutely. Because what would happen is that, so when we have a conflict, it just does not affect our military. It'll affect our, critical infrastructure. It'll affect our economic supply chains. It'll affect the voyage from the South China Sea, for instance, right? And so the world is dependent on, for instance, the import of critical oil from the Persian Gulf, for instance, Nepal or India. And if you have a conflict, say the US Navy and the Chinese Navy have a conflict, right? Because it'll be in a multi-domain conflict. What that would mean is that countries like Nepal, India, Bangladesh, dependent on export of oil from the Middle East, would have constraining factors. And the important point is that we depend on oil for so much, right? For running our infrastructure, running our cars, running heavy industry. So everything is going to get impacted in a sense. So yeah, it will have a deep destructive influence in the world, especially today when the world is so intertwined. Now, in terms of the Russia stand on the India border conflict, Pramod, I would like to, maybe we can have a conversation on that some other time, because I haven't followed the meeting today. So if I say something, I might not be offering you the correct perspective. So we can always have a conversation just on the China-India border and the role of Russia.
Okay, let me put the last set of questions. First, what should be India's take on current relations with China? Do you think India should renounce one China policy? Second, there is a discussion in India on boycotting of Chinese products. Can China afford to boycott Chinese goods? What will be the impact? What will be its impact on India's economy and India-China relations? Third, John Bolton, he said that Trump asked Xi for help on re-election. Your reaction on it?
What is the last question?
John Bolton, he wrote in his book that Trump asked Xi Jinping for help in re-election in his second term election. How do you react?
Yeah, of course. How the reaction? Yeah, I haven't read the book. I think it's getting released tomorrow, June 23rd.
Yes.
So yeah, hold on. So can you repeat the first question, Pramod? Sorry.
First question is on like what should be. I mean, there is there are like India. Let me. India's. Yeah. I mean, how should India react to China at the moment? Like, what should be the current state of India-China relations, and do you think India should renounce one China policy?
Yeah, sure. So, well, that's a political question. So, should India renounce one China policy? So that will have to undo the historical agreements, even by the Vajpayee government, right? So, so coming to how should India react to China? I think India should be deeply concerned about China's claim on its disputed territory. And I've been saying this not today, but for the last maybe 20 years, that it is very important to understand that when China is claiming parts of India's, for instance, Arunachal Pradesh, right? 90,000 square kilometers of territory, which includes some portion of Assam as well. So if you look at the mapping, it includes about 4,000 square kilometers of Assam. I think there is a deep concern with that particular claim because it creates not just national security fear in Delhi, but from a local perspective, it creates a huge amount of concern as to what will happen if China is able to come in and take over the territory today, because it will be better prepared than it was in 1962. And the argument that I know that we have strategic thinkers in Delhi that argue that India is nuclear now. India did not use air power in 1962. But that does not salvage the concerns of local people. And their concerns are what I think is missed in Delhi. And actually not given serious thought. And I think that is why India, from a national security perspective, should be very careful as to how China is actually establishing not just claims, and I predicted this in 2007, that they will go about establishing their claim by building their military infrastructure, military exercises, building their military forces to be able to function in a very high altitude area, which happened now, right, in the Galwan Valley, which is a extremely high altitude. So I think it's very important that India realizes that China is extremely serious about its claims, and then to build a very strategic narrative long-term and strategic capability as to how do you then go about defending this particular area, right? One gaming, which we should do if you want to do a war gaming exercise and a tabletop exercise, is to see how could India have behaved differently in terms of what happened, say, in the dispute that just recently occurred, right? And wargaming is a way to actually improve not just your narrative, but also your hardware capability. That's number one. Number two, should India denounce the one China policy? I think I am on the side that you can use that as a leverage. So instead of, I know that there are ideological belief systems that want to do that, but I think what India can strategically do is that India can use that as a bargaining leverage vis-a-vis China. That if you continue to escalate the conflict, if you continue to behave in an irresponsible manner, if you continue to want to have military engagements at the border, we might have to rethink on our one China policy. So I think if you're a strategic thinker, you need to think long-term and how you can use particular policies that could benefit you in the long run. Is that all, or was there any other question?
Yes. Like another was on boycotting of Chinese products.
Oh, yes. So first for that, for me to answer that question honestly, I will have to do a diagnosis statistically based on how much of India is dependent on Chinese-made products, right? For instance, in the US, if the US is to boycott Chinese-made products, I think the US economy will be in trouble. Because if you look at, and I'm not talking about just clothes or grocery stores, I'm talking about medical supplies that are made in China. My older family members depend on Chinese-made drugs to survive. And so it is extremely astrategic to think of boycotting Chinese goods in the US perspective. In the Indian perspective, so again, let me answer this by taking two scenarios. One scenario is that India is deeply dependent on Chinese-made products for its critical infrastructure, not just retail, not just grocery stores, not just Diwali crackers, but dependent for medical supplies, dependent for infrastructure, oil. Then I think boycotting Chinese goods does not make strategic sense. Now, if you're just dependent on China for retail or phones, which I know India is, Indian, I know there are Chinese companies that offer great smartphones. Now, if you're thinking of doing that, then you'll have to think long-term as to how do you go about doing that without it having an impact on India's economy as a whole. Because India-China trade is not so small. It's actually quite a large amount of trading goods happen between India and China. So we'll have to think long-term and strategically on how we can do that. We cannot do it tomorrow. You can have it as a slogan and feel nationalistic about it. But as a strategic thinker, you'll have to think through the process.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Namrata. It was indeed an interesting discussion. We learned a lot. On behalf of NICE and all our participants, I'd like to thank you for your time and the wonderful lecture.